So you are free to go. And so, yeah, you have about
Great.
30 minutes,
Thank-
35 minutes or so. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Sure. Thank you for everyone for showing up and participating. I think it's appropriate considering we're talking about participatory design. I'm just going to dive right in. Let's see. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with IDE, but we are an international NGO that's been around for about 32 years. And what's unique about IDE is that we really try to work through the private sector, and we believe in the power of entrepreneurs. So we've been putting businesses to work for the poor for more than 3 decades using market-based solutions to change the living conditions and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. So we started out with a focus on agricultural technologies vis-a-vis water, and have over the last decade grown our water sanitation and hygiene portfolio, which in this sector we called WASH. So I'm going to start by describing some of our founding values that really define who we are. Our founder is Paul Polak, and he's famous for saying, "Don't even bother if you cannot reach at least 1 million customers." So for some people, that's a bit provocative, but scale is really in our DNA, and scale is ultimately what we strive for. Some of the other values that comprise of IDE's DNA include the importance of starting with people. So we use a methodology called human-centered design that really assumes nothing. We go in with a beginner's mindset and really try to deeply understand the lives that people lead, so we can design solutions that are appropriate for their needs. We also make sure that when we design to context, because although scale is important and scale and replication are important, we need to make sure that the solutions we design are actually appropriate for the unique constraints and drivers of each country, of each culture. And thirdly, we truly believe that business and the markets are powerful levers of scale because there is an embedded mechanism of sustainability via the profit mechanism. We believe business and markets are well positioned for scale and sustainability, which is why we work with a market-based approach. And finally, at the end of the day, it's always about results. You can go into a program with good intentions and with well thought through activities, but if you do not actually see results and if you do not track results, then you cannot understand whether your efforts are working and whether you're actually doing the best you can to achieve the intended results. So we're quite proud of having a very strong measurement team, and I'll share some of the analysis they've been doing to explain how we do what we do. So throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about 5 different frameworks to get to the question of what is the role of participatory design. And I'm going to start at a more theoretical level. I'm not sure if you guys have been exposed to this yet, but this is a framework by Liz Sanders of Make Tools. She's come up with this framework to explain how she sees the design community evolving in terms of its approach. And I want to highlight 2 axes. So on the x-axis, you can see she has on the left side an expert mindset. And with this expert mindset, the designer is the expert. The users that you're designing for are subjects. They're seen as clients or beneficiaries. And in contrast, on the right side of the x-axis, she calls this participatory mindset, where your users are co-creators and collaborators in the design process. So for her, it's really how are you approaching this from a mindset perspective. On the y-axis, you have what she calls a design-led approach, which is very much using design tools. In contrast, you have the research-led approach, which bases its approaches and tools on research approaches, such as ethnography, anthropology. And so it's more to do with the tools that you use to answer the questions you're looking to answer. She takes this framework to another level, where she maps different design approaches that have emerged. So in the pink large bubble, you have, what is currently known as user-centered design. And you can see there are smaller bubbles within the user-centered design space that she calls out in terms of the types of mindsets and tools that people are using. So for example, usability testing and human factors ergonomics usually refers to UX type of questions where the designer is an expert. The user is considered, well, the end user, and you're really testing for whether or not something is conveniently, easily used. Then you have contextual inquiry, which is really, the approach where you immerse yourself within the environment of the user. It's very ethnographic in nature. You may do some homestays, you may shadow the lives of your users. And then you have, approaches like lead user innovation, where you have Bright Sparks, the niche user, who is really leading the design process in a certain way, but it's still inspiration for the expert. So that one straddles the participatory mindset and expert mindset spaces. I'm going to call out a couple more. So in the blue space, in the top right corner, you see generative design research. And the idea is really to bring inspiration to your participants, your co-collaborators, your co-designers, and get them to generate many different ideas. And there's an infinite number of possibilities in terms of your design solutions. So the tools used are oftentimes inspirational, for example, films or role plays, and that leads to different types of design solutions. And then you have critical design, which is very different from everything else here because it takes a critical mindset. Instead of trying to conform to the realities of your design environment, it's really trying to get people to think critically and question the status quo. And she also calls out an emergent space called design and emotion, which I personally don't know a ton about because it's still very nascent, but it's really about bringing together the emotions of your community and letting that inspire your design solutions. And on the right side, you have participatory design, which has been made famous by the Scandinavian communities where your users are co-designers literally, where they're not just generating ideas, but they're actually with you designing the actual product. So I find this map very helpful in terms of understanding the considerations at play when you talk about participatory design and what that is in a reaction to and what also that spawns. So I think the next logical step for this conversation is when you look at this framework that Liz Sanders has presented, it's a question of, well, who are you designing for and what are you designing? In IDE, because we take a market-based approach, we look at design at 3 different levels. So I'm going to start from the right, actually. Most immediately, when people think about design, the layperson usually thinks about designing beautiful chairs, right? Designing products. Sometimes they might consider service design a design approach. And so, under product design, service design, you have considerations like what types of materials are you using, what is the manufacturing process, what is the usability and ergonomics, how do you engage your customers. But IDE really believes that product design is really just the tip of the iceberg. You can have a great product, but if you don't have all the other components, your product will never make it into the households. So it's really important that we also consider business model design. And what does that entail? So business model design entails not just the business, the firm itself, but the value chain around the firm. So what comes before and after the firm. It also includes the internal operations, the management information systems of the firm, the sales and marketing approaches of the firm. So that's what we consider the business model design approach. And while that is important to think about the business model and the value chain, because we work in a public sector space, that's not sufficient. So we also look at program design. And what does that entail? So program design includes sectoral engagement. How do you engage the other NGOs in the sector, the businesses in the space, the government officials, the public goods environment? We might be designing a toilet, but a toilet in this case is quite a bulky product. And if you don't have the proper roads, the finance environment for it, it's much more difficult to deliver scaled toilets across multiple countries. And we also think of program design in terms of entailing industry engagement. So who are all the players in the sanitation space beyond just our immediate firm partners? So this is how I like to think about how we approach design. And I'd like to start a conversation around, when we talk about design and participatory design, who is our audience? Who are we designing with? Who are we designing for? What is the objective? And how do all the pieces come together? So I want to talk about how we approach design for end users. So in this case, for water and sanitation, the end user is households, rural households. Usually they're smallholder farmers who are living on less than $5 a day, sometimes less than $2 a day. And so that's our target market. And if I were to put ourselves on the Liz Sanders map, I would say that generally when we design for end users, we have an expert mindset. Our users are seen as clients, and we take a research-led approach. The designers on our team oftentimes come from a strong ethnographic background, and we use strong research methodologies to inform our design approach. So why do we take an expert mindset research-led approach when we're designing for end users? Well, because in our founding values, we've always seen our end users as clients. In fact, Paul Pollock is famous for saying, let's not call the people we're designing for beneficiaries. They are clients, because when you are a customer, you have voice. You get to say, I do not like it, I do not want to buy it, or I like it, I want to buy it. And that's in contrast to, I think, the traditional international development approach of calling these target audiences beneficiaries, because beneficiaries oftentimes are passively receiving. They do not have a voice often in what they experience, what they get handouts for. And that's often the reason why the solutions don't stick. So that's part of why we take an expert mindset, because we do see the audience as clients. On a practical level, there are limitations of our target audience capacity in terms of code design. There are some in the wash space who say we should have a participatory approach, which means the users themselves need to design their own toilets. That really frustrates me, because I ask you, how did you ever have to design your own toilet? No, probably because you're not best positioned to design your own toilet. And it goes even further. There are limitations in our audience in the sense that, for example, in Cambodia, when we bring a 2D prototype to the audience, it's difficult for them to think in an abstract way. So they'll literally say, oh, it's too small, when actually it's a model that's supposed to be 10 times smaller, right? And so there are just limitations in the audience of what you can do in terms of code design. And in contrast to the critical design approach, we really do take an affirmative approach in terms of conforming to the environment we're in. So ultimately, we're trying to change the status quo in terms of improving the lives and livelihoods of our users, but we do so by working within the constraints of their environment. We take the approach that it's much easier to design to what people want than to change what they want. So that's why it's in contrast to the critical design approach. Not to say that there's not a role for critical design, but in the space we work, that's not the most appropriate. Now I want to talk about the design approach we take when we're designing with program partners. When I say program partners, I mean everyone from the businesses we work with, to donors, to other NGO partners, to government officials. And when we design with those types of program partners, I would put us more on the participatory level, participatory mindset space, and a design-led approach. So why do we do that? It needs to be a co-creative process because it's important for legitimacy and buy-in. When you're working with donors, other stakeholders, government especially, they need to own that process so that it's sustainable, so that the different drivers and constraints that all the stakeholders have are taken into consideration. And again, it's still affirmative. We're working within the constraints of the environment rather than being very provocative. and questioning the status quo more directly. So that's why we take a participatory mindset and a design-led approach where the intention is often to be very generative, to create lots of solutions first, as opposed to presenting one main one first. So now I want to talk about a third framework, which explains why we take a participatory mindset approach when we're working with program partners. So this is the strategic triangle framework by Mark Moore. He is a professor and researcher at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he talks about the importance of considering three aspects when you're doing systems design in the public forum, in public sectors. So first of all, public value. Is it a valuable endeavor? Are you actually making society better off? Second, operational capacity. Is it actually feasible to do this based on your budgets, based on your HR? And then finally, authorizing environment. Is it legitimate and supported? And this is the one I want to highlight because oftentimes people, are very careful to think about, well, is this actually adding value and can we do it? But what's often neglected is the authorizing environment and paying close attention to the legitimators, those in your environment who give you credibility and who really allow you to succeed. So again, just wanted to emphasize that let's think about the third leg, especially when you're designing in a public space. So right now I want to talk about a couple of examples for how we've used these various frameworks oops, sorry, I just had a bubble pop up. Okay, how we have used these frameworks to design for our programs. So the first one is from our Vietnam program. Our Vietnam program is quite unique because we're taking a market-based approach in a communist country where the government plays a very strong role. So we have to gain the legitimacy and support of the government. So we are working through the government to be change agents to drive market changes. Forgive me, I'm going to read off of these next couple of slides because I actually think it's very compelling. It's this case study we've done on a member of the Women's Union. Her name is Luan. She says, reflecting on her experience working with us, she says, "To be honest, I had doubts about this project when IDE and the provincial CPM, the Center for Preventative Medicine, discussed the project with us 2 years ago," she confessed. "I personally did not think this project can work with absolutely no handouts. My doubts even increased when I participated in IDE's training on sanitation marketing and consultative promotion skills. I thought to myself, oh, there's some sort of multi-level marketing company and want me to sell things for them. Oh, I do not want to do that. I am a government worker, not a salesperson." So this is the environment in which we entered. We take a market-based approach, so ultimately you have to sell something, but when you're working with government, there's obviously conflict of interest, and they're embedded in the communities. They don't want to be seen, perceived as trying to take advantage of their constituents. And they're also very used to a handout approach where people don't have toilets, give them free toilets. And it's highly subsidized, but very unsustainable. So after working with her a bit, I think she's had a bit of a change of heart. She says, well, things were not easy at first. I felt I could never talk about building latrines in front of the district people. I thought I would give up. Then I received a lot of insistence and support from the head of the CPM and IDE team. They travel with me to the commune. They sit with me after I've conducted an activity and provide constructive feedback on how to improve. I felt I've improved a lot. I gradually realized the value of the work that I do to the district people. That is to help rural families to have hygienic latrines for better sanitation. With this project, I've done things so differently than I used to. Before, when I talked about having a latrine, I would talk about having one to avoid diseases. Now I listen more to people to know what problems they face and give them advice. More importantly, we now pay more attention on the supply network. We train masons and ring producers, but if we never worked with them, let alone train them. I learned all of these from the project. Convincing people to build latrines is still very challenging. Working with commune health staff and getting them to do what they are expected to do still requires a lot of effort, but I do believe what I am doing brings value to the life of my district people. So I want to highlight a couple things from this slide. First of all, she herself is taking a participatory approach, right? She is listening to her constituents, her clients, and understanding what their drivers are. the drivers are not always health when it comes to a health product. Their drivers are status and convenience. So we've been able to impart that participatory mindset to this government official. Secondly, we've also been able to demonstrate that when you talk about engaging community, it's not just your end user, it's the value chain, it's the market around you. So she's realized the importance of working with masons and the suppliers in that network, because unless you have supply, you can create all the demand you want, but you're not actually going to find a solution. So just wanted to share that story as an example of not just how IDE does participatory design, but how we impart different aspects of design and participatory design values to the change agents we work with. So the second example I want to talk about is from Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, the market is very, very different. It's a country that has a lot of exposure and experience with sanitation. So most households actually have a toilet. It's just that it's extremely unhygienic. There are lots of flies, and you question really whether or not it's imparting any health benefits. And so on the demand side, you have a very aware and sensitive population who understand the value of sanitation. It's more a challenge on the supply side. When we first entered, there weren't desirable, affordable products that people could buy. On the supply side, Bangladesh is also a very interesting environment because the market is actually quite robust. You have large manufacturers and a network of distributors for different industries. You can make plastic products, whereas in some of the other countries we work with, plastics manufacturing is not possible, so you have to stick with bulky materials like concrete. And in Bangladesh, we also had the opportunity to work with a multinational corporation that some of you may know by the name of American Standard. So it was a partnership facilitated through the Gates Foundation, where we worked with American Standard, where we brought the on-the-ground expertise of knowing the users and the markets, local markets, and they brought high-quality industrial design expertise. And so together, we co-designed a product called the Sato Pan, which we have now convinced a national corporation called RFL, plastics manufacturer, to invest in and produce and to distribute across the country. And so what I want to highlight with this example is that when you're designing for a market, if you have available at your fingertips access to different types of global partners, national partners, use those opportunities and think about designing for not just your end user, but for the needs of the businesses. So for a business to survive, they need to make profit, right? So we were able to demonstrate to RFL that there is a market opportunity to sell to 90 million people. And even though the product is less than $1, 90 million times $1 plus customer acquisition opportunities with other product lines is a huge market opportunity. So right now, RFL has invested in developing new products to expand their sanitation product line, and we're working to facilitate them with local distributors to ensure that the products make it to the last mile. The fourth framework I want to talk about is what we call finding the sweet spot. And I bring this up because in the international development space, we often find lots of people obsessed about increasing affordability, which is obviously a key constraint of the users we face. That being said, especially if you want to take a market-based approach, again, you have to sell someone something. If you are needing to sell someone something, you got to sell something they're willing to buy and can buy. And when you have those constraints, you also have to look at desirability and viability. So do people actually want it? I mean, it sounds like a simple question, but oftentimes that aspirational, the desirable, gets neglected, we find, at the cost of trying to maximize affordability. Second, feasibility. Is it technically possible? Can you make it? Can you produce it in your environment? And finally, viable. Is it financially sustainable for this to last a long time? So all the solutions that we generate, all the potential solutions that we generate have to go through these three filters. And the sweet spot is where you find your ultimate solution. So I want to give the example of the easy latrine, which ID is really famous for. When we first entered the Cambodian market, It was our first sanitation program in terms of designing a product that we're trying to sell. And we went in, really wanting to maximize affordability. So we asked our potential customers how much they were willing to pay. And most of them said something along the lines of, well, maybe $10. So we worked really hard to design a $10 latrine. It was made out of bamboo, brought it back to the users to get feedback. No one was interested. No one wanted to buy it. So we said, well, obviously this is not going to work. And we went back to the drawing board to analyze what people said they wanted. They wanted a pour flush latrine. They didn't want a dry latrine. They wanted nice tiles. They wanted it to be offset rather than a direct pit. They wanted to be able to access it more easily, so home delivered. So we ended up designing an IKEA type of latrine that's pre-packaged, home delivered, pour flush, ceramic. Turned out to be about $35, way above, more than double than what people said they were willing to pay. And guess what? We've sold hundreds of thousands of them. So it's just a lesson to reflect on in terms of when we're designing for marginalized, vulnerable communities, we often think affordability is the main constraint. If you're taking a market-based approach, and I would say if you're taking any approach to get the users to adopt and buy into your solution, it needs to have a minimum level of aspiration. And that level of aspiration differs, right? So the latrine in Southeast Asia is much more sophisticated than the latrines we're developing in Africa because people are used to much different environments and offerings. So, but the key is you need to design with a minimal level of aspiration where they're willing to pay for it. So what are the results? So this chart shows what we've accomplished across our 7 countries in the portfolio. The flagship program is Cambodia, but Vietnam actually is our oldest program. It's been around for a while, since 2006, and we are growing it. So if you have any specific questions for that, you can direct them at Kwang later. But we've actually expanded quite quickly in that we've replicated to 6 other countries over the last 6 years. So that's very rapid global expansion. We're proud to do that because we think there are lots of lessons learned that we can replicate across the different countries. One of the other interesting elements of the results we're seeing is that we're increasing in our cost effectiveness in terms of reaching scale faster across different countries. So on this chart, the shaded areas show the cumulative number of sales across 3 countries. Blue is Cambodia, green is Bangladesh, and orange is Nepal. So you can see that we're hitting scale earlier. The lines show the cost curves, a moving 6-month average of the cost to the program to deliver 1 latrine. So you'll see spikes. These spikes indicate upfront investments that we've made for R&D. And I think that's one thing to be very clear about when you're taking a market-based approach is that market development is not necessarily cheap. It takes a lot of investment to do R&D, to do product design, to do the participatory design process, to engage stakeholders, to train businesses, to recruit sales agents. All of that takes money. But we believe that that upfront investment is justified because you then have exponential sales growth, which our results are showing. So that's another way that we measure results. The last framework I want to talk about is scaling scale. So far I've talked about scale in terms of the number of clients we've reached. And that's what Paul was talking about, in terms of reaching 1 million people at least. But I actually want to broaden the conversation about scale to say, what are other ways we can think about scale? This is a framework that Peter Frumkin of Harvard has come up with, and he identifies 5 dimensions of scale. First, program expansion, as we often know it, to increase the number of clients you reach. Second, geographical expansion, having multi-site replication. And third, comprehensiveness. So are we just doing sanitation? Are we doing sanitation and hygiene and water and other elements of health? Fourth, financial strength. So is it financially sustainable, both at the firm level, at the industry level, at the program level? And fifth, is it accepted doctrine? When we first entered this space 6-7 years ago, our biggest challenge wasn't actually trying to sell latrines. Our biggest challenge were those people trying to give latrines away for free because that undercuts the market. If you're giving latrines away for free, even though you're giving it to 1% of the population, the other 99% will be like, well, I'm going to wait for my free latrine. So it's been a work in progress where I've been actually quite proud of the progress we've made in terms of demonstrating to the sector at large that a market-based approach can be effective in reaching the poor and increasing sustainability. So I would say in a certain way, IDE has made progress on scaling via the accepted doctrines I mentioned. So finally, I want to ask a couple of probing questions to the working group. How might we adjust our design process to reflect different objectives of scale? According to Frumpkin's framework, according to different audiences at the program level, at the firm level, and at the product level. Second, what trade-offs do you find yourself frequently making when assessing how much of a participatory mindset versus expert mindset you should take? How do you select whether you take a research-led or design-led approach? Is it just based on the tools you have, or is it based on different objectives, combination of both? Fourth, does it matter what sector you're in? Compare vaccines, for example, with toilets, both health products. But would you take a participatory design approach with the vaccines? Is it a matter of risk? Is it something else? Is there an element of designing for vaccines that could be participatory in nature? And finally, does it matter if you're designing a treatment or delivery solution? If you're designing a pill versus how you deliver that pill, how does that affect how participatory you are? So these are all questions we wrestle with, and I put them out there to get you guys to think about, and I'd also love to hear your take on it. And I'll come back to this slide, but please know that you can follow us across a variety of mediums. We have just launched a new website, ideglobal.org. You can email me with other follow-ups. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And the second bullet point is a microsite we've created dedicated to the Cambodia flagship program, explaining some of the lessons learned. So I'll stop there. I think that's exactly 30 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, Yi. This is fantastic. I really thoroughly enjoyed this presentation and understanding your overall approach and how it fits in with the larger framework and giving some really concrete examples. I think this is great. I want to allow people to respond because I think you've raised some really interesting questions that we grapple with all the time, particularly thinking about, trade-offs when, assessing, how much of a participatory mindset versus expert mindset, selecting, research-led versus design-led approach. I mean, these very much fit in with a lot of the things we're grappling with. So I'm going to let the working group members react first and respond. But thank you so much. That was great. So,
my pleasure.
Is there anyone who wants to go first? Winthrop looks like he's ready to jump in.
Yeah, this is so great. You have no idea how well this fits with the issues we're grappling with. It's almost spooky. Validating.
I had a good brief from Kendra.
It's great. Well, yeah, and I assume so. So maybe if you can go back to the slide, my question is around the 4 quadrants and sort of the different approaches. Might be just easier to see that. Yeah. So it's interesting because the work we've been doing in PIA and with DLab seems to put us a lot of times into the Scandinavian area.
Okay.
And I think the argument that we make in terms of those trade-offs is maybe I'd define the trade-off as scaling versus empowerment and agency and stimulating an innovative mindset among clients or customers, as you say. And so I'm just wondering whether you see any fundamental, how far are you willing to go with this trade-off between co-creation and scaling? And because I think what we find is that that they are often mutually exclusive, and you really could only have participatory design in something that you're scaling, at a large, like to the level of Paul Pollock's million. You're really limited. So I don't know whether you guys grapple with that. I think I don't want to speak for the whole group, but I think we tend to kind of maybe go the opposite direction and say we're willing to sacrifice some scaling in the interest of empowerment, if I've made myself clear.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a live question that happens a lot in the sector, in the development space. You have, participatory action research, you have different participatory theories and approaches. I think I want to talk about two things in response to your question. One, who is your audience and what is the intended objective? So I call out the difference between end users and program partners because what we're able to do and we want to do is very different with each group. And I don't need to rehash that. The second thing I want to talk about is what you mean by empowerment. We find a lot of people in the participatory development school of thought where they try to go about it with a co-creative process to maximize empowerment. But I often find that it inadvertently becomes a shirking of responsibility where instead of actually servicing the clients and getting them what they need, which is honestly like basic water and sanitation, you're asking people who don't have any ability or expertise in designing, a sanitary product to design their own toilet. And I would say you're shirking responsibility because you do have that capacity. So why aren't you doing that? So I think like empowerment is important, but I think how it's defined depends on the audience you're dealing with and the baseline they're starting with.
And also maybe the goal. So is the goal to solve that sanitation problem, or is it something maybe that's more underlying than that, is to have a community identify its problems at a local scale? So maybe it's a scale question too.
Yeah, and I would say like what you interpret as empowerment matters too. So I would say Paul Pollock would be very much about empowerment, but for him, empowerment, he asked the question, why are poor people poor? Because they don't have money, right? Very simply. And so the objective then is to design a solution that helps them increase their livelihoods, their incomes, and that is actually like financially, tangibly empowering so that they can participate in the market. So you can go through an empowering approach or process, but if it doesn't lead to empowering results, I think then that's the question we wrestle with, like what are their trade-offs? And I would say squarely land in having empowering results.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah. Very elucidating. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I think one of the things I think we engage in, particularly in D-Lab, we engage in not only kind of user-centered design, but also participatory design, really kind of this co-creation process of having people participate, actively on the teams. And then we also do this kind of design we do these trainings for local people who literally they design their own products. They're not working necessarily with outside experts. In a lot of ways, they're designing their own, coffee shellers and coffee bean shellers and things like that. And I think one of the things I grapple with, trying to think about is there is this empowerment piece, as Winthrop was mentioning, a lot of what we see from those particular trainings, there's a change in mindset, that they're more confident and they're able to kind of tackle challenges in their own lives. And, but I wonder whether that's the most effective way of kind of developing products, or if it's the most effective way of really empowering people. Because I think about it, and sometimes, so in the past, I'll give you an example. This is kind of a funny one. So I'm not personally a designer. My background's in social science, and I remember when we first moved to our new office at D-Lab, they said, okay, great, you guys are all going to make your own office furniture because we're going to empower you to do that. And I said to myself, I said in a staff meeting, I said, this is not a good use of my time. I really, no matter how much you're going to empower me, I just don't think it's there are other ways to empower me more effectively. And so I don't know if I necessarily have a question. It's more of a comment that things, I think about, how do we empower people effectively to feel like they can take on their own challenges, and how do we get, services or products or programs to people who need them, and deliver products and programs that are going to be useful to those particular people. So I'm getting to the point where I'm not sure that those things necessarily, that the empowerment piece necessarily needs to go with the kind of product development participation piece. Anyway, it's just something I'm grappling with, and how do we effectively empower people, but how do we also get them kind of what they need?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. I mean, I think it parallels the design your own toilet story.
Yeah.
And I think, like, for me, empowerment is ultimately about agency and voice, right? Are you able to give feedback around the type of office furniture you want, versus just getting stuck with whatever gets handed out, right? So there are many different ways to empower people. And what you talked about earlier in terms of the change in mindset and building confidence, that is critical, I think, as a part of how we work. I mean, the example I gave of the Vietnamese lady is clearly a case of that, right? And we work with a group called Whit and Roy Partnership, WRP, and they have a framework to understand the components of success. So it's race, results equals attitude plus competency plus effort. And attitude is the fulcrum. So you need to have the right mindset to be able to leverage competency, your capacities, and the effort you put in. So the mindset is ultimately very important. And we find that a lot more in our ag space, because we are teaching people new skills, helping them access much more powerful technologies to increase their productivity. And so from those agricultural cases, you find a lot of stories about increasing confidence and ability. I think in the sanitation space, because the intervention is really around delivering a product to the end user, it's less obvious. So again, I think it depends on what your objectives are and what actually makes sense in terms of having empowering results.
Great, thank you.
Can I speak a little?
Yes, please, Ricardo.
I was in the Amazon in 2012, and I stayed in a house at the upper Amazon, Caeté River, and I stayed in a house of those natives, and they had no toilet, no bathroom. So you had to wash yourself in the river and go to the bathroom in the forest with all those mosquitoes. So probably your project would be very interesting there. And then this was in the Amazon. Then this was another project of some friends that work with permaculture in Bahia, and they were living in Bahia near the coastline, and there was this community, low income, and they had toilet was very, very native. It was not healthy. So they said, let's project a dry toilet, because dry toilet, you don't need water. The excrement becomes manure, and you can use that for the garden, for vegetable growing, things like that. And they were developing those toilets together with the community, and the community, one of the members said, well, you know something, this toilet is very interesting, but we like the toilets you have at your home, conventional toilets. So it's like, well, you have a toilet different than mine. Why do you want to build this toilet for me? It's more effective, but they had this critical conflict between a modern toilet and a permacultural toilet. Then comes the third case, happened with a firm called X-Runner in Sweden. You probably know about them. And they had a tremendous success in Peru, in Lima, because they were developing these small dry toilets for Lima that has very low level of water, of water resources. So the dry toilet with effective microorganisms, the little powder, worked effectively. So it grew very at the low-income neighborhoods, and it grew very much because it was a solution for the environmental problem they had. The environmental problem was low rainfall. So, as seen from the perspective of environmental science, well, you have the Agenda 2030. We have to reach those indicators put forward by the UN, and it has to do with a better world. So think globally, act locally. And there is also research regarding how much carbon are in a windmill or one of those structures for alternative wind production. So they're beginning to analyze how much carbon in the production, how much output, and how to minimize that carbon footprint. So it's coming to a point based on the indicators of loss of biodiversity and all these numbers, that these solutions should have you mentioned desirability, feasibility, viability, and sustainability. It's like, how much impact will I produce with this product, and how to minimize it and provide a good quality of life for people, local people. If it's a product that requires, for instance, you mentioned the bamboo latrine. That's very interesting because it's local. You don't have to bring it from another place. You don't have this carbon footprint. You don't need industrial development. So I find very interesting when you find a local solution with people and materials that they know how to work with. And that's a challenge you need to. So basically, do you think in your map design research, you have different, very interesting mapping system. Does the environment or the sustainability indicators enter this part?
Yeah, you bring up some really interesting examples, and I'm really pleased that you bring up sustainability as another lens that we should evaluate potential solutions. I do want to address some of the examples you bring up because I think they're good case studies in some of the questions we wrestle with. So the example of the Amazon community, I think, again, within the IDE approach, our lens is always a market-based approach, right? And so whether or not we would choose to work in the Amazon depends on whether or not it would be feasible for a market-based approach. The market-based approach is great, but it is not a silver bullet for every environment. In order for a market-based approach to work, you need to have businesses. You need to have value chains. You need to have a dense enough population where it makes sense to service that client population. So from what I understand of what you're saying of the Amazon community, it sounds quite remote and difficult to reach. And in that case, we would likely not suggest a market-based approach, at least initially, until that is your remaining market. In terms of the permaculture and composting toilet examples you gave, so this is what I mean in terms of a lot of people fixating on the technical feasibility aspect and affordability. So it's a technical solution to the problems we face in terms of treating waste and reusing waste. But if people are not interested or willing to use it, or do not want to use it, or ultimately they're not willing to pay for it in a market-based approach, then you will only literally get a handful of people who will adopt it, which we see unfortunately happening more often than not, because people neglect the desirability lens. I think in the case of X-Runner, part of the reason why they are successful is that because they're not only fixating on the water scarcity issue, but how they deliver the solution, the business model around it, the customer engagement aspect of it is user-friendly. And so I think those components often get overlooked because it's not as tangible as a physical product. You have to have the right physical product, don't get me wrong, but it's still just the tip of the iceberg in terms of having a complete and sustainable solution. And then lastly, on your question about sustainability, absolutely. It is very important, and it's something that I would say we could do better with. We're trying to very much solve some immediate urgent problems like lack of clean drinking water and sanitation. And one of the biggest challenges in the sanitation space is how do you design sanitation solutions that are sustainable, and sustainable defined in many different ways, right? Sustainable for the environment, sustainable financially, sustainable physically, it lasting a long time. Like sustainability by definition is just, it lasts a long time, right? And there are lots of drivers for how things last a long time. For example, being environmentally responsible, being financially sound. And so I think some of the other lenses captures some of those drivers. But from a sustainability standpoint, it is the multi-million, trillion-dollar question of how do we do waste management, or more appropriately, fecal sludge management in a rural environment. There are technologies that can treat the waste and reuse the waste, but are financially very difficult to implement at scale because you don't have the population densities as you do in urban environments. So it's a challenge we face in WASH. On the water side, we've actually been participating in the carbon market because we've shown that using a water filter saves you a lot of energy when you don't have to boil water. So part of what's helped IDE and our company Hydrologic achieve profitability is that we looked at all the different resources that play in the market, carbon market being one of them, and that helped us increase our revenue intake and get us over the hump of scaling and reaching financial profitability. So all those components you talk about are very much at play. They're much more nuanced than people take at face value oftentimes, which is oftentimes the most tangible product element or the technical feasibility element. So yeah, in the bamboo case that you bring up, yeah, it would have been great if we were able to use local materials, but the people didn't want them. And so in the approach we take, we believe it is easier to give what people want and to design to their desires than to change their desires. You will have to heavily subsidize that marketing approach.
Great, thanks, E. Were there other questions from the group?
Were there any questions sent through the messages? I can't access that for some reason.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I don't think so.
I don't think so right now. No, I know Kelly had to run at noon. Yeah. Okay, I guess, so I was curious about your question. So we've talked a little bit about this. So as Winthrop mentioned, we're, developing these hypotheses of kind of, when should you be, using the most appropriate kind of design methodology, whether it's more participatory or user-centered, and at what points does it make more sense? I mean, obviously, depending on what you're trying to achieve, there are certain things that's going to kind of push you in one direction more so than another. I was curious, from your perspective, one of your questions you're asking, does it matter what sector you're in, comparing vaccines to toilets, and is it a matter of risk? And for me, I mean, I guess the question is, so for me, both of those products seem pretty technical, right? And so I would probably be more inclined to, engage more in a kind of user-centered design approach as opposed to necessarily a co-creation approach. But I'm curious from your perspective, have you guys thought about that? How much does the kind of how technical the product is? Does that have an effect on which type of participatory design approach you use? I'm curious from IDE's perspective how you guys think about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, toilets are relatively complicated for the end user market we're working with. I'm not a concrete expert myself, so I could not design my own toilet, plumbing expert. And so, which is why I say, like, for the end user generally, even with some simple technologies like mechanical pumps, I would still say we put ourselves in that expert-led side of the spectrum. For a matter of expediency, expertise, lots of reasons, and the target audience we're designing with, we're designing for. In terms of the complexity or specialization of a particular product, it definitely has a role in how we approach design and how we as an organization approach design. Because, for example, we have engineering capabilities within our team, but that is limited to a certain type of product, certain type of engineering challenge. Once we get super complicated, we would probably outsource it ourselves. So even though we do in-house design, our capabilities limit us in terms of what we're able to do in-house. And so there is something to be said about specialization, because why try to do everything when there are people who can do it better, right? Unless it's a core part of who you are and what you stand for, in which case then I think you've got to look at some existential questions of what is in your DNA and why do you need to do what you do, or why don't you need to do what you do?
Yeah, I'm curious. So it sounds like, and based on your presentation, very much the kind of delivering something to the user, it is very much user-centered design, whereas if you're engaging in a partnership to kind of developing a program, you're more likely to be more participatory. Are there any examples where you guys engage in more kind of participatory design in product development, or is it always just kind of more user-centered design?
The only example I can think of is when we're designing with the businesses we work with. So they kind of straddle the space of whether they're a program partner or they're a user, because they're not the end user, but they're a very important user in that space, right? They need to be able to want to know how to afford the molds that we're designing, the production process that we're designing, the manufacturing value chain that we're designing, right? And so in that way, because they are the owner of the business, they need to have greater agency in determining what is possible, what's not possible. So that's a good example, I think, of where we're straddling both.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Other comments or questions from the group?
I think one quick comment. Reading between the lines of the things you've said, my question is, do you see the same thing I think that I see, which is, so participatory design has become kind of fashionable, a buzzword, and I see often a disconnect between the practice and the rhetoric, and also that, from what you're saying, it's not a silver bullet or a magic bullet, and it's okay to not have something that is fully participatory, and it's okay to call it out as such without it sounding derogatory. That's kind of an observation, opinion I have. I don't know if what you see, whether that jives with what you see and sort of how you see it.
Can you speak a bit more about what you mean when you say the practice and the rhetoric aren't necessarily aligned?
I think in the international development, everyone talks about being participatory. And then when you look under the hood, a lot of times it's kind of the same old practice, very top down, not necessarily even user-centered, user-centered design or human-centered design. And so I'm just wondering whether you face that kind of tension of maybe, if you want to call it kind of a branding problem, in talking to others and to kind of pitching what you're doing, and having sort of clashes in expectations where people think they want to do participatory design, but then they really don't. I don't know if maybe I'm not making myself clear.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I think you're talking about three very different things, related but different. One is people wanting to do participatory design but not actually doing it or doing it poorly, which we often see actually. On the one hand, it's good to see that user-centered participatory design approaches are becoming more of an accepted doctrine. You know, that level of scale has started to occur. On the other hand, it's kind of like a little bit of knowledge in the hands of people who don't know how to do it can be actually quite dangerous, in that it risks the reputation of the approach itself, right? And so that is definitely an issue we see. We see a lot of people claiming to do it without either doing it well or doing it period. So that is definitely a risk, and one that we try to manage by being very clear about what we mean by participatory design, when we do it, how we do it, why we do it, to put some meat on the bones for what it actually stands for. The other point you make in terms of whether or not it's okay to say you don't do participatory design, I think we got to look at why participatory design emerged, right? I think it was a reaction to a lot of top-down imposed solutions. And I feel like the pendulum has swung a bit too far, where it's the only assumed right approach, without actually being very nuanced about why it's valuable. And it's valuable because you actually want to design solutions that people want, that people will use, and most likely to do that, you got to engage them. Right? And so, like, for me, it's quite simple. It's about having the right voice and input in the process to make sure your solutions are empowering. And again, I want to focus on solutions being empowering and not necessarily the process being empowering. I think like people fixate on the process being empowering, but at the end of the day, like our fourth brand pillar is results rule. So it's always about results, right? Is the solution empowering? So I think it's important to highlight that what we do is very much user-centered, and it's in contrast to a patronizing colonialist view, but it doesn't necessarily always follow the very strict definition of co-creation and participatory design as Liz Sanders has mapped it out.
Yeah, we found a kindred spirit. Thank you.
Hi, may I make a comment and a question?
Sure.
You see, I was thinking, I just finalized an environment education plan in Brazil. And I was thinking about the dry toilet and the bamboo solution. And I was thinking if environmental marketing and environmental education prior to the product or prior to the participatory process wouldn't work. Do you think it would work?
I don't know the context or the target audience so well, but if you were to ask me to bet on it, I would say not without heavy subsidy in terms of the educational marketing process. Again, I'm of the mindset, and I'm biased in that it's very difficult to change people's beliefs. If they already have an existing system of values around sustainability, around caring for the environment, around reuse, then I would say you have a higher chance of success. But I mean, the greatest challenge facing us globally is the environment, and we can't work on it, even with the most educated of markets. So yeah, for me, I think like people often think the issue is behavior change and education. Like, we find knowledge is barely the issue. People know what the right answer is. Whether or not they're willing to change their behavior depends on if you're triggering the right drivers. And often those drivers are more latent, more psychological. So yeah, I don't know. There might be drivers there that you can trigger without it having to do with education and awareness. It could be a matter of status. For example, I see the environmental movement in the US taking off because you're more educated, you're more modern, if you are more environmentally responsible, as opposed to, yeah, I actually believe that the environment is important. I think that comes later as a justification for why you're changing your behaviors, but I also might be a bit cynical in that way.
Yeah, here in Brazil, it's very common, very popular, the dramas and television. So if an artist, an actor, an actress say something about something, it can become a fashion. And now the latest opera they had, this drama, they talked about sustainable agriculture, organic farming. And now people are talking about that because, you know, in the drama, they spoke about that. It can become a fashion, but it's out of the control from your business. It's not does not control the drama. And it's a lot of money involved with television, all that network. But anyhow, it's a way of seeing that people, the human beings, they like something that's in fashion. So if it's in fashion, people tend to appreciate more sometimes.
Yeah, I think most humans try to fit in with the environment they're working in, and you know, using celebrities and mass media can be one way to do that for sure. It is expensive, and depending on your target market, like a lot of efforts we see in the base of the pyramid spaces start with mass media, but it neglects the fact that the consumers we're working with either don't have a TV or the fact that the purchase they're looking to make is a huge portion of their income, and so they would prefer to talk to someone about it, which is why we've actually started focusing on direct sales and below the line marketing instead of mass media. So again, like knowing your user and their drivers and their constraints is ultimately going to serve you well, whether that's, you know, upper middle class Brazilian or, you know, someone who's living on less than $2 a day.
Great. Thanks, Yi. So we are coming to the end of the time. I just wanted to check and see if there are any additional questions before we wrap up. Additional questions or comments from anyone else in the group? Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Yi. This was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It fits in very well with a lot of things that we're talking about, and I think gave us some really great examples of you know, how IDE thinks about these particular components and you know, when to use different types of participatory design and how to prioritize those things. So I think this has been just awesome. So thank you for preparing this and bringing all of your colleagues on along with you as well. And yeah, we'll post the recording. And I don't know, Yi, do you want, I'll share it with you as well, but I don't know if, do you want me to share it with your other colleagues as well, or what?
You can share with me and I'll send it out.
Okay. That sounds great. And so we'll be posting this and some notes and things like that up on Basecamp. And I will several of our people, as I mentioned, couldn't attend today, but I'll highly recommend that they review this and watch this session. I think it'll be very helpful for them to see kind of how you guys are thinking about these things. So thank you again for your time. And
thank you for organizing and welcoming us.
Yeah, no, it was great. And yeah, and we'll be in touch soon. Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.